Welcome to the Darkened Hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour, and I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald, my co-host, Richard Cox, and our special guest from antiwar.com, political connoisseur, Dave DeCamp. Dave, thanks for joining us, pal.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Dave, listen, I think the important topic here today is something that's unduly underreported by the legacy media here in the United States, which only focuses on Iran, China, and of course, the conflict in Ukraine and the largest humanitarian crisis in the world right now currently. And I think those numbers are rising out of 750,000 fatalities and over 1.3 million displaced is the conflict in Yemen. You have been one of the primary sources of reporting regarding the conflict in Yemen. I think the introductory question for this, Dave, to you is following: is why has this been a huge conflict? What has been the precipitating factor in the conflict regarding Yemen and Saudi Arabia?
Well, it really, the Saudis first intervened in Yemen back in 2015 to the current conflict. They've fought the Houthis in years prior, but to get to where we're at today, it really goes back to 2014, 2015, when the Houthis in 2014, they took over most of North Yemen. So before the end of the Cold War, Yemen was two countries. It was North and South Yemen. And it's really actually kind of West Yemen, the area that's the north. And the Houthis took over most of that, driving out the forces of the U.S. and Saudi-backed government of Mansour Hadi, who is the exiled president. He was actually just recently replaced by the Saudis with like a presidential council. So he's no longer the president, but the Houthis actually allied with Salah, who was the president before Hadi. He was taken out. So they took over, and then in 2015, they drove Hadi out, and they solidified control of Sana'a, the capital. And that's when, in March 2015, when the Saudi, UAE, and other Gulf country coalition wanted to intervene to oust the Houthis and put the Saudi and U.S.-backed government back in charge. And the U.S. gave them their full backing. And there's a lot of reasons why they did so. And one of the big ones was, which was reported by the New York Times, was they wanted to make the Saudis happy, or to placate the Saudis, because they weren't happy with the Iran nuclear deal. And this was kind of, okay, we could give them this war because they are totally reliant on U.S. support. The U.S. maintains their Air Force. They were much more involved when the war first started than they are today. They give them targeting data and intelligence and logistics and supplies. And the U.S. Navy helped blockade Yemen. The Saudis imposed a very brutal blockade. That's why it's such a bad humanitarian crisis, because it's not just the bombs that are killing people, it's starvation and disease. And so the Houthis are a tough bunch of Zaidi Shia Muslims. And kind of the misnomer that you get in the Western media is that they're an Iranian proxy, that they wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Iran. So it's a war against Iran, but that's not true. The Iranians back them, politically, and to some extent militarily, probably. We don't really know. There's a lot of kind of propaganda that, the narrative is that they're totally armed by Iran, but there's not really evidence of that. But the Houthis, again, they're Zaidi Shia, and that area of North Yemen was ruled by Zaidi Shia imams for 1,000 years until 1962. And then the Houthis grew out of a Zaidi Shia movement that wanted to kind of reclaim the area of North Yemen as Zaidi Shia. And that's where they come from. So it's a homegrown movement. Again, the idea that it's a war against Iran just isn't true. But, they're, again, indigenous, tough group that, no matter how much you bomb them, they're not going to go away, similar to, the Viet Cong and the Pashtun Taliban in Afghanistan. They're always going to find a way. And so that's why the war has lasted so long. And if you look at from 2015, when they intervened, the territory hasn't really changed hands much. Yeah, the Saudis have launched a brutal air campaign, but the forces on the ground didn't capture much territory from the Houthis. So that's why it's dragged on for so long, and the Saudis just didn't want to give it up. So their prescription for that was to just hurt Yemenis and punish the people of North Yemen. And that's why so many civilians and children have died in the war.
At the same time, Dave, you also have the third factor at play of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the Islamic State also entering Detroit by bombing both the Saudi government and the Yemeni government as well. So they have to deal with that as on top of it. But you also have, I believe, a UN brokered nationwide truce that began on April of this year. Has that truce been broken? I know they've been trying to broker a truce a number of times, but has there been a peace deal that's been negotiated by the two and agreed to by the two, or has the Saudis fractured that deal?
So first, just talking about AQAP, Al Qaeda, it is really important to mention that a few months before the Obama administration backed the Saudis in Yemen, they were allied with the Houthis. They were sharing them intelligence with the Houthis to fight Al Qaeda, to fight AQAP, and then they turn around and back the Saudis in a war that's benefited Al Qaeda. There's been reporting from mainstream sources from AP that the UAE and the coalition have recruited Al Qaeda fighters to fight the Houthis on the ground. So the U.S. ends up backing Al Qaeda. But anyway, so with the peace deal, so this deal was negotiated end of March, and it came into effect, I believe, April 1st of this year. And it has been very successful. It was definitely the most successful truce of the war, and the deal expired in October. But it's kind of still been holding. There haven't been any Saudi airstrikes in Yemen since March. So that's a huge deal, and it's a big relief to the people of Yemen. They've also eased the blockade somewhat. They've let more ships go into Hodeidah, which is the Red Sea port, because that was really something that was putting a strain on the civilians, because that's where the fuel comes in. And with no fuel, you can't deliver aid and food and stuff. So again, it's still under blockade, but they're letting more ships in. And then the Sana'a airport, they're allowing like limited flights out of there. That was closed for years. So this stuff is all good, but the ceasefire did expire in October, and there's been an increase in fighting on the ground. And so it could really kind of spark up at any time and escalate. And actually, right before they reached this truce in April, Saudi airstrikes really spiked. And it was one of the deadliest few months for civilians since much earlier in the war. So there's always a risk of it getting really bad again really quickly. And I mean, that really showed kind of the hypocrisy of the U.S. as Russia invaded Ukraine, and they were all this rhetoric that they have about that war, but while they're also backing the Saudis, destroy their neighbor in Yemen. So yeah, again, it could really just pop off again at any time now.
During Biden's presidential campaign, I remember him making several campaign promises that were in line with Obama's doctrine of withdrawing from the Middle East and focusing instead on China. However, the promises that he made were to return to the nuclear deal with Iran, to end the war in Yemen, and to treat Saudi Arabia as the pariah that it deserves to be considered to be. And what happens during his first year, not even first couple of weeks in office, Biden, he absolutely absconded away from these promises, downgraded the position in Iraq, pulled out advanced military installations in the Gulf region, and instead goes and visits the Crown Prince Salman, and is actually, well, what can I say? His goals were not met in oil production. Saudi Arabia finally found out what they're worth and realized that they're the real drivers at play here. So Biden came away empty-handed. Khashoggi's murder is still blamed on Saudi Arabia, but nothing is solved, and the Yemen crisis continues. So is this basically the U.S. position in that we'll allow what's going on in the background just to appease the Saudis in order to become the primary regulators of Saudi oil?
Well, yeah. I mean, so when Biden first came into office, I believe it was February, right after he was sworn in, he came out and said that he was ending offensive support for the war in Yemen. but that turned out to just be a lie, because a few months later, the Pentagon admitted that, oh yeah, we're still servicing their planes, which is like at this point the most crucial support that they give the coalition. And at the time, they were still bombing Yemen, so that was just nonsense. And then when it comes to the Saudis, I mean, the Democrats and Biden were really unhappy that they made those oil cuts with OPEC Plus in October, right before the midterms. So you're right, by giving them what they want, he's still kind of not getting what he wants out of the Saudis. But they're still choosing not to really punish them or make them a pariah, like he said, or just kind of, it's not that you really have to punish the Saudis. You could just stop giving them so much support. But he's not doing that. And I think the Saudis are smart. They know how to play the U.S. Just recently, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, went over to Saudi Arabia, and they, declared this new strategic partnership. And they signed like a declaration, but it's very vague, just saying that they're going to increase trade in all these ways. But I think part of it was the Saudis signaling to the U.S. like, hey, you can't get rid of us right now. We'll go to China, which is now Biden and the Pentagon. They say that that's their top priority. They say China's the big threat, so they don't want to lose the Saudis to China. And then if you want to get into what just happened in the Senate with the war powers resolution, that's another example of how Biden is still just trying to placate the Saudis.
You have a lot of also other elements that play here that have their own agenda. And for example, like I remember Secretary of State and former DCI, Mike Pompeo, who back in, I want to say it was like in the spring or summer of 2019, pushed through like an $8 billion arms deal to the Gulf, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Jordan, and of course, Saudi Arabia, citing that there was a large activity of the Iranian influence in the region. And at the same time, while that's happening, you also have, Israeli air defense who are bombing Iranian outposts in Syria, who are, trying to, along with the Turks, the Russians, to basically, eliminate what's ever left of the Islamic State. And at the same time, you have the United States and Israel basically trying to circumvent that issue of eliminating what's left of the Islamic State. And of course, you've reported on this many a time about Timber Sycamore, which was the CIA operation of funding those Islamic State under the guise of, we're just trying to alleviate the destruction of Bashar al-Assad's ruling democracy in the country. But you can't have it both ways, can you, have it, Dave? So is there a link between trying to destroy Iran's allies while destroying Iran's influence in the regions such as Syria and cutting off the link to Lebanon?
Yeah, well, that's a major part of it. And if you see what Israel and the U.S. want to happen right now is that, since Israel signed those normalization deals with the UAE and Bahrain, they've been increasing military cooperation with them and the Saudis too, kind of behind the scenes. They haven't normalized with the Saudis, but what they want, really, what the U.S. and Israel want is an anti-Iran alliance, like an anti-Iran NATO in the Middle East, pretty much made up of Israel and the Gulf states. So that's another part of why they're kind of still giving the Saudis and the UAE what they want, because they really do want to form, because the U.S. is still sort of pulling. They've definitely, they're still involved in the Middle East, of course, still in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Somalia, but they have drawn down a lot, and they're trying to, shift their resources away from the region toward the Asia Pacific, but they want to leave behind, this anti-Iran alliance. That's their goal here, I think. And it is funny because it's focused on air defense, but Israel's the one that's always bombing its neighbors. They're the one that's always bombing Syria and occasionally Lebanon. And they portray this, again, these Houthi attacks. One of the reasons why the Saudis are looking for a way out in the war in Yemen is because the Houthis got really good at bombing their oil facilities inside Saudi Arabia and the UAE as well. But so they portray all those Houthi attacks as Iranian attacks, even though it's clear that they're doing it in response to the war in Yemen. Like, it's not Iran directing these attacks. They're doing it because they're at war with the Saudis, because they waged a war on them. So you just see how the propaganda is used to kind of justify their next plans for this alliance that they want.
Can I come in with a question there regarding motivation? So we hear this narrative that the US's interest is to placate the Saudis, to maintain the alliance, to keep Saudi Arabia on board with the oil and everything. But do you think there are more good old-fashioned imperialistic reasons for the US having a direct interest in Yemen and essentially using the Saudis to fight a proxy war? And what I'm thinking is that Yemen is resource-rich in terms of oil, apparently other minerals, and geostrategically, at the far end of the Red Sea from the Suez Canal, the British have wanted control of Yemen since the 1830s and fought a bloody war. Apparently about 200,000 people died during the British exit of Yemen in the 1960s. So do you think that it is just a case of the US supporting what is essentially a Saudi interest in these kind of resources? And I'm assuming that you would maybe agree with that, but maybe you could speak to that also, what exactly the Saudi interest is, what they hope to get out of Yemen. And I've heard the resource argument, and I've also heard because of its position relevant to East Africa, there's kind of water pipelines and all sorts they could go in for there. So what I suppose, what you think motivation is on those two levels. And then I'll just put my sort of an additional question in now. On the other side of the motivation coin is, what would motivate Saudi Arabia to get out? Because I've heard different accounts of how damaging these attacks on infrastructure from the Houthis in Saudi have been. And do you think that really could be the driving force for Saudi to back down? If the Houthis can give them a bloody nose, it could be sufficient to end the war.
Yeah, so as far as their interest in the Saudi control, I believe that there are resources in Yemen that they want, and that the location, on the Red Sea there is very strategic to both the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And like I said about that alliance that they want between Israel and the Saudis and the other Arab states, is that because the U.S., it is, imperialistic in that way, that they want to draw it down from the region, but they still want control over the region. So they want their allies to, come together to secure these strategic areas. I think that's definitely a major part of it. As far as the Saudi interest, I would say, I haven't really analyzed it too much, I guess, but I would say probably just the control over the area. The border area with Yemen has always been a little volatile because the Houthis are up there. Control over Yemen and the resources and that area on the Red Sea. And then, sorry, what was the second question?
Oh, regarding, you sort of answered it previously. I think you were going there. But regarding the Houthi attacks on Saudi infrastructure, do you think they could be a sufficient motivating factor to get the Saudis to the table and to really make them think twice if they're going to get a truly bloody nose?
I definitely think so. Yeah. Because they were launching them for a few years. And then back in September 2019, I forget the name of the facilities that they hit, but it significantly impacted, they were pretty major attacks and really impacted their oil production. And they had to repair it. So I think that definitely put a scare into a lot of the Saudis. And it was from then that we started to see more talks and efforts towards peace negotiations and a ceasefire. So I think what the Houthis were able to do definitely played a major role in the Saudis looking to de-escalate. And I think still, even though with the ceasefire expired and there's always the risk of escalation, I think the Saudis are looking for a way out and do want to end this war, but they also don't want to cut a deal that's too good for the Houthis. They don't want to recognize a Houthi state, really finally admit that they are they've controlled the area since 2015. And they don't really want to cede that to them. So, there's all these things at play here, but I think if the U.S. really backed off and they could make the Saudis make a deal and end this war pretty easily, I think, if they wanted to.
That's an extension of the question, really, because it's asking what would motivate the Saudis to come to the table. But then the deeper question, and probably the more important question, is what motivates the US to come to the table?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think right now, what would motivate them? I think they're still trying to just keep the Saudis happy with these oil cuts and stuff. So if there is still some element, of the Saudis' desire to keep this war going, I think the U.S. just doesn't want to be the one right now to try to push them to the table while they're dealing with this other kind of crisis of relationship with them. I think right now they just don't want to lean on the Saudis to end the war because of all that other stuff.
What's funny is that a couple months ago, Dave, this was actually, I don't know if it was coincidental or not. I'd like to get your thoughts. When Biden came away from that meeting with Prince Salman and was pretty, there was a lot of negative feedback regarding legacy media about, how Biden should have handled it and, the fist bump picture. And what happened was a couple of days later, the largest and most important documents relating to an FBI 9/11 investigation called Operation Encore came out. And I said, wow, that's just great timing. Here's Biden who came away red-faced from a meeting. And then all of a sudden, these files come out regarding Operation Encore and the investigation of Saudi complicity and financing to certain 9/11 hijackers in the 9/11 attacks. And I thought, maybe this was U.S.'s way of saying, if you don't acquiesce to our demands, we'll just have, these files just suddenly leak out showing your complicity. Does that make any sense? Or
yeah, I mean, the timing definitely is very suspicious there. I think they could have been trying to send them a message with that. And media-wise, I mean, it's interesting to see because, like, the Washington Post probably has a lot to do with the fact that Khashoggi wrote for them, but all the liberal media has been like pretty critical. It's like one of the few areas where they're critical of Biden. Just the fact that he hasn't actually made MBS a pariah or done anything about Khashoggi. It's kind of the one issue that they seem to be unhappy about with Biden. And that's why I think recently this thing that was in Congress, the Yemen War Powers Resolution that would have ended it would have directed the president to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. I thought it was the perfect time to get that pushed through because the Democrats, because of the oil cuts, and as well as the media side of the Democrats and the liberals, were just not happy with the Saudis. But still, it just wasn't enough to make anything happen.
There's been a lot of pressure on the Saudis. I mean, coming from the United States. First was to get rid of the religious ulema, the religious police, and have women rights come back in the country. There's been certain restrictions been lifted, but I mean, we are talking about the only country in the world governed by two states, which is the federal state, the monarchy of the kingdom, and then you have the religious ulema, Wahhabism, as it's sold at the same time. But there's been a lot of disconnect between the religious fanatics and the sector of Saudi Arabia and some sympathizers within the kingdom itself. And, I was talking about this with my co-host Richard Cox before you came on, Dave. A couple of years ago, we saw these rumors that were coming out that there was going to be a coup against Salman and that there was bombings heard inside the kingdom itself. And we're wondering whether it was, the factions are trying to get rid of Salman and his very repressive governorship and, whether or not to bring back the old line of thinking. And Salman under pressure from the United States and probably from, the coalition partners like Germany and France and Australia and others to say, hey, wait a minute, you're a country that's, bringing about these fanatics like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, and we need to cut back and we need to show that you're willing to acquiesce to our demands and basically, act as a good partner in good faith. They have in certain regards, but they haven't in others. And, with the Khashoggi murder, it just goes to show you that this country basically runs on horror and authority regarding what they're about. Is that ever going to, I mean, we always hear it from the United States, Saudi Arabia is trying to reform. Mm-hmm. Can they really reform?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say. I know one thing that's been ignored a lot by the media is the fact that this year, I believe, they went through with like a record number of executions. They're still doing things like that, and they execute minors or they execute people that they prosecuted as minors. And the reforms that MBS, I think they were very minor, the things that he's done. Although when he did it, I remember it was kind of before the media was so against him in the U.S. He did very minor things, and they kind of touted him as this like hero of women's rights because he was going to let some women drive or something like that. They used to get very like favorable coverage. And it helps with the Saudis because they speak great English, and, they can sound kind of, they seem like they're pretty in tune with the West and the US and the culture. So I think they had a pretty good way of spinning themselves as more, less, old fashioned and Wahhabist than they really are. I think their PR used to be a lot better. But since the Khashoggi thing was really the big turning point for how they're viewed in the West and in the U.S. Nobody cared about the Yemeni children that they were bombing and starving. It was killing the guy who wrote for the Washington Post that turned everybody on against them.
There's not, I've said this before, that the reason why everybody knows about the Israeli lobby is because we share a lot in commonality with the state of Israel. I mean, we have the largest Israeli nationalists existing in the world, which is the evangelical Christians in the United States. They are basically similar in terms of governing democracy, how they deal with dissidents and, dealing with the Palestinians, how our police deals with regular civilians in this country. And that's another discussion. But we share almost nothing in common with Saudi Arabia, nothing. And this is, and a lot of people are surprised when they find out there's an actual Saudi lobby inside the United States, but they exist in the shadows. And that's only because if the United States basically finds out what Saudi Arabia really is about and what they're really governed by, they'll be horrified and say, why on earth are we dealing with one of the most repressive, most ghoulish governments on the face of the earth? And then we might question about whether or not we need to deal with them in the first place. And maybe this is the reason why, Dave, and I'd like to get your thoughts about why the legacy media has not reported on this, the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, which is Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why. And it's funny, too, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, because even now that there is more criticism of them, everything, the U.S. media is like hyper focused on, human rights abuses in like China and Iran and all these other countries. But still, even now, like you don't ever see like big reports in the New York Times about women's rights in Saudi Arabia. It's still not really getting critical coverage. And then as to why the war in Yemen just got such little coverage, I mean, it's really hard to say because it is like a shocking amount, like shockingly small amount of coverage that the war has gotten. I remember this is one of the reasons that I started writing and everything was because during the Trump administration, it was all Russiagate, Stormy Daniels. And there was this report from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, that analyzed, I believe it was 2017 to 2018, a whole year of like NBC coverage. And they covered the war in Yemen like 0 times. But, and then they put out the numbers of, how much they've covered Stormy Daniels. And this was when, the bombing campaign was at its most brutal. And more people woke up to it in 2018 when they bombed a school bus full of Yemeni children. They killed about 60 kids were killed in this one airstrike using a U.S. made weapon, and so that was so brutal that it got more attention. But then even after that, it fizzled out again. So there are interests. I would say the Saudi lobby is pretty powerful, and the arms industry, that's why the Trump administration, continued the policy. And that's what was funny about Trump is that he would say, oh, we got to keep being friends with Saudi Arabia because, Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin, they're making all these billions on selling them weapons. So that's definitely a big part of it, too. And it's bipartisan. It was a war started by Obama and continued by Trump and now, again, continued by Biden. And it just doesn't fit anybody's narrative. Nobody wants to hear about Obama helping kill kids in Yemen. And even Trump, I mean, for all the really horrible things he did, the media focused on things that weren't really important and were also kind of embellished, especially the Russiagate stuff, that a lot of it was just totally made up. I think because Obama's implicated in Yemen too. So maybe that's a big reason why.
It is incredible that there's this force in society that can pick up the attention of millions and millions of people and place it somewhere, and place it not somewhere else. Like, it can place it on Ukraine and say, this is horrendous, this is a humanitarian disaster, and all the rest. And everyone has those emotions, that genuine feeling evoked within them. But it can also take it away from somewhere like Yemen. And it's such a magic trick that's I can only describe it in terms of magic, because it's not something I could rationally explain how any group could have such a power to do that, to direct attention that way.
Yeah, especially with Yemen. I mean, like, if you see the pictures of kids, it's like so horrific. And it really is, as the UN, like, it's not just us saying this, this is what the UN has determined, that Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and the US is fueling it, but it gets such little attention. It's pretty frustrating and kind of like disheartening too, thinking about it, because it's like, what you think if you could expose something so horrible that would get enough people to pay attention to it. But even though there's all this information out about it, still, it's just, furthest thing from so many people's minds.
It reminds me of the show Westworld, where the robots can be programmed to not see things that are right in front of their face if it doesn't fit the narrative, the script that they're running on. And that's what it feels like the media can do.
Yeah.
Humans are kind of robot-like that way.
Yeah. It is. It really is something.
You have a wide spread of war crime accusations happening at the same time. And this is not getting the attention from the international theater, no less. One of the rare reporters reporting for the ground is Faria al-Muslimin, who's actually documenting the war crimes that have been committed during the conflict. And then you have the one example of the internationally displaced person camp, which was hit by a Saudi airstrike, while Houthis have sometimes prevented aid workers from even giving aid, even to their own forces. And the United Nations and several human rights groups discussed the possibility that war crimes have been committed by the Saudi Arabian and Gulf camp. And it's been largely ignored by the international press. And I think there was one even British reporter, Alex Wall, who wrote that the responsibility for Yemen goes beyond even Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to London and Washington itself. So, I mean, you have United States, you have Britain, who sells, $4.5 billion of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. 500 million of that goes to the United Arab Emirates since the war even began. The United States spending billions of dollars of armaments to Saudi Arabia itself. That's 8.8 billion, I think, recently, earlier this year. The money goes on and on and on. But yet, all this money that could be supported for armaments for war could also be spent at the same time, Dave, to the human rights groups on the ground, trying to appease human rights groups to try and bring both parties to the table, bring an end to the war. Why hasn't this happened yet?
I mean, like you said, I think it is a matter of just the money that there is to be made on the war, and how the U.S. they still want to control the region, so they're just going to kind of give the Saudis and the UAE what they want. I mean, sometimes I do think, like, I always just thinking about the current situation with Ukraine and Russia, and how the U.S. has sent about $20 billion worth of weapons over there, and spending is going to be well over $100 billion pretty soon once Congress authorizes the new package. And you wonder, like, how could they be this reckless, like risking a war on Russia's border with risking nuclear war after the Cold War? Like, everybody forgot all those lessons. And I try to, like, think about what secret conspiracy there might be, or what's really behind it. But sometimes, I think it might just be as simple as the money to the weapons industry, the military industrial complex. I mean, right now, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, they can pretty much make as many weapons as they can sell to Ukraine. They're making money in all sorts of ways, by the U.S. sending weapons to Ukraine, refilling its own stockpiles, buying weapons for Ukraine. The Europeans buying new weapons now. They want to modernize their militaries. It's just like a complete boondoggle for the arms industry, and that it doesn't matter how dangerous it is. And then you think about China, there's a lot of American corporations that have a lot of interest in making money in China, yet relations with China are really going down the toilet, and the U.S. is putting all these economic sanctions on China, I think because, the military and the mic is more powerful than the other corporations in our country because they're just so interwoven with the government. I mean, you have the guy running the Pentagon is a former Raytheon board member. So I think a lot of that is true when it comes to Yemen, that it is just a matter of money and power to control the region, and they could also make a ton of money off it. So why not keep doing it?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Lynn Malouf of the Amnesty International was quoted as saying the international community has a responsibility to close the gates to all arms sales that are fueling the needless suffering of civilians in Yemen in the armed conflict. And I happen to think that there's a lot of factors at play. You have the military-industrial complex, you have foreign lobbyists, and you have other individual interests that are outside the United States, like Great Britain, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, all at the same time fueling this conflict. And at the same time, what's not being reported are the war crimes, are the actors in the field and foreign theater, domestic theater, all having these nefarious agendas at play here. Something has got to give. And I think with honest reporting, and that's saying something because we don't have that, if we could just make inroads to that and get enough people, because there are people who are against this war. I mean, you have World Human Rights Watch, you have Amnesty International, you have a lot of foreign correspondents on the ground in Yemen trying to report the best they can over the tsunami of propaganda and disinformation regarding the conflict. It's all about getting that break. And I happen to wonder if that case was Khashoggi himself. And one of the reasons why they killed was because of that, as well as him reporting on 9/11 in Saudi Arabia links to the incident itself. But I mean, or am I just making a pipe dream here, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's tough to say because all the information on Yemen and how horrible it is out there. But what will move people to act and it's tough to say. But yet again, I mean, there is actually a pretty strong group of lobbyists in DC and anti-war groups that get legislation in Congress to end the war. It just always kind of fails to make it, like Trump. There was a resolution passed in 2019 to end U.S. involvement in the war that Trump vetoed, and they didn't have enough support to override the veto. And then just recently this year, there was a war powers resolution introduced in both the House and the Senate, and they gained a ton of bipartisan support in the House, not so much in the Senate. But this was a pretty big effort by activists, and libertarians actually got very involved, thanks to Scott Horton. I mean, the Libertarian Party and us, antiwar.com, and all these other groups got people to call their senators and flooded the lines, which, I'm pretty cynical. It's something I would never really think to do, is to call my senator about something. But when you have this kind of movement growing, again, it's really thanks to these anti-war lobbyists that work and operate in DC. They're mostly leftist groups that for a lot of congressional staffers or former congressional staffers, they know how to get things moving. And then you had this war powers resolution that Bernie Sanders was ready to introduce. And this was just last week. They were going to hold a vote. And he said, yeah, I think we got the votes. And then the day, I believe it was last Monday or Tuesday, that he said, vote was scheduled for 7 p.m. that night. All these reports came out that the White House was working against the resolution, telling senators to vote against it. And then you saw Democrats changing their position. And then Bernie Sanders folded and caved into the pressure. He didn't even introduce it for a vote because there was a chance, according to people behind the scenes, were saying that they think they could have gotten 5 to 8 Republican senators to vote in favor of this. So even with the White House pressure, it still could have passed. Now, even if it made it through the Senate and House, Biden would have vetoed it. That's what they were threatening. But it still could have sent a message to change things. because back in 2019, when that resolution passed through the House and the Senate, the UAE like withdrew from a lot of its forces from Yemen because they saw that they were losing support in Washington. Now they support a lot of militias on the ground in southern Yemen there. But they did kind of scale back their role in the war. So the pressure does do something, even though it's easy to get cynical and think that there's nothing we could do. But I don't know. I mean, what happened with this Senate thing, that was pretty deflating because it seemed like it had enough support to get through. And then but when you have to rely on politicians, that's not what I'm suggesting either, is that we should rely on politicians. I think getting the information and the message out there to people is the thing that we should be focused on, but it's tough.
That was a depressing issue because I actually was watching part of Sanders' speech, and I remember cutting out the video and saying, I got to post this on my channel, and showing that Sanders basically, deflated the issue. It caused a huge stir within the libertarian circles because as soon as he did that, I mean, on Twitter and viral media, it was flaming Sanders time. It was all over the place.
Yeah, and it actually did, I think, get the war in Yemen back on a lot of people's minds again. But it was funny, that speech, because I was watching it. So he comes out and he says, I'm not going to introduce the bill because the administration is against it. But then he went and delivered the same speech saying what this resolution would do. And it was like a pretty good speech. And at the end of it, he's like, but I'm still not going to introduce it. It was just funny because he gave the same speech saying like how good it would be to pass this resolution. Like, why even give the speech? Why not just give up?
Maybe trying to save face at the same time. I didn't know, but I thought that would be the final nail in the coffin of having any hope for, opposing, the war machine of Congress itself. And it's a deflating issue. But we still have this, libertarian anti-war consensus, as you pointed out before. And it's what got me on board of seeing, and that's why I met with, you and Reed Coverdale in the libertarian, because I wanted to see for myself just how much of a force this consciousness has. Because if it wasn't for this, I'm basically a full-blown pessimist. I don't care about the future and stuff like that. Stuff. So, no, but when I got to meet the young and old at this libertarian conference, it did give me a little bit of hope that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
So, because I was really surprised at it. I said, you know what? There are people that really do care. But I needed to see that for myself. And I was very glad I went. And so there is an anti-war voice that are going on. And it did. I'm glad you brought this up because it did bring back the Yemen conflict to the table, that speech by Sanders there. But where does it go, right? And you answered it before. You just don't know where this is going to go for. I would like to think that we have one more full year of Biden next year, and then we have the running for the new president. And I happen to think that out with the old, in with the new. And I happen to think that this will be a Republican president. A lot of people are fed up with the Democratic establishment. I think a year and a half into it, COVID mandates, the conflict in Ukraine, revisitation to the Cold War theater, the crisis in Yemen, just a slew of just disastrous policies, and notwithstanding the most unpopular vice president in our lifetime with Kamala Harris. And I think there's going to be a change. Now, whether this change comes with DeSantis or Trump, and I think DeSantis has the backing of the conservatives anyway, I think DeSantis wins. But what does this mean for Yemen?
I think it's bad news for Yemen because what the Republicans, what Biden, the whole issue with the Saudis, the OPEC oil cuts, a lot of Republicans have been very critical of that. And a president like DeSantis, I think he might make a point if he comes in to kind of a rapprochement with the Saudis to let's get our relations with Saudi Arabia back on track and give them whatever they want, which could mean even stronger support in the war in Yemen. I wouldn't be surprised if that's how they approach it. I mean, it's still who knows what the next few years will bring, because that's definitely going to impact it. But I mean, like I said, Trump and his people were all in on supporting Saudi Arabia and in the war in Yemen. And I think DeSantis, when it comes to the Middle East, his policies are going to be really bad. And I do agree, I can't imagine Biden winning in 2024. But it all depends on who the Republicans run. And, right now DeSantis is the front runner, but you still never know. I mean, things change so quick. You look back at the 2020 election, did you think Joe Biden would be running for the Democrats? It's hard to imagine that. So things could change really quick, but I think that a Republican president isn't going to change much when it comes to the situation in the Middle East now. Might even be worse. With Ukraine, there is some dissent on the Republican side against this support, but it's a pretty small minority right now. Hopefully that grows. But when it comes to just overall, Republicans are all about, arming Ukraine. So I don't see a big change there either.
No, and that's why we bring up the issue of who they're going to run the Democratic side. Hillary Clinton basically said that she would support Biden to run again. I'm like, he can't physically do this again. I mean, when it comes to war, Dave, is that, the president is basically hesitant to, going full out war or conflict, whereas a younger president would entertain such an issue. And I think DeSantis, who is basically an AIPAC supporter anyway, hard AIPAC supporter. I asked this question to Scott Horton years ago, and I'll ask you the same question. What would this mean for Iran at the same time?
Well, I mean, it's tough to imagine things being worse right now with Iran and the U.S. Because Biden, he never returned to the nuclear deal. When he first came into office, he could have lifted sanctions and they could have returned to it right then. But he didn't. They had these long, drawn-out negotiations that didn't go anywhere, and they've been increasing sanctions. Now with the protests in Iran, they're saying outright, that they support the protesters. I believe that they're probably trying to give them some sort of material support. And they keep increasing sanctions, and Israel is becoming more and more threatening. They just simulated bombing Iran. The U.S. and Israel just did joint drills. And you have Biden administration officials saying that they'll use a military option against Iran as a last resort to keep them from making a bomb, even though the Pentagon they just recently released their nuclear posture review that said, that acknowledged that Iran has not decided to make a nuclear weapon. But that's still kind of the basis for all these tensions. So, I mean, the only way it could get worse is if Israel or the U.S. outright, start a war with Iran. And I think with China kind of being the priority, I don't think the U.S., whether a Republican comes in or not, has an interest in starting a full-blown war with Iran. But I think they would kind of just maintain what is now the status quo, is like this Cold War in the Middle East between Israel and Iran that involves covert attacks inside Iran and all these really bad sanctions and bombing Syria all the time. And that, I think we're just going to keep that up for a while. But that could always spark a war. You could lose control of that situation pretty quickly.
I mean, weren't they trying to precipitate war with Iran just last year? I think you had the issue in the issue with blaming Iran bombing a Saudi Gulf ship.
Oh, the tanker, yeah.
Yeah, the tanker itself, and they closed the port to the sea. Trying to goad Iran, basically, and Iran won't bite. But let me play a hypothetical for you, Dave. What do you see in the next 5 years regarding Yemen?
Regarding Yemen, it's tough to say. The worst case scenario would be that no real peace talks happen and the war starts up again, and the Republican president comes in and kind of gives his full backing to the Saudis. And it just goes back to what it was, blockaded country, this bombing campaign, and a lot of fighting on the ground. But I do think there's a chance. I don't think we're going to see like a good peace deal come out of this, but I think maybe what the situation is now, they might negotiate another short ceasefire, and just kind of, it might just be like a frozen conflict for a few years. But 5 years down the line, I think the chances are slim of the Saudis, without pressure from the U.S., and it doesn't seem like we're going to see that pressure, signing like a real durable peace deal with the Houthis. that would surprise me if that happened, unfortunately.
Richard, any follow-up questions?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Very happy with the questions I've asked. What are your thoughts,
Yeah.
Adam? Is that a
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Dave, thank you very much.
Well,
for
I would
coming
actually,
on.
there's one question. I would like Dave to comment on where people can find his writing. Well, it's at antiwar.com. But and also just talk a bit about the podcast that's been going on for a few months. It's like a daily news roundup of anti-war writing, which is like half an hour. And it's a great way, I'm finding, to just keep on top of the current issues. So could you say a few words about that, please, Dave?
Yeah. So I write all my writing is at antiwar.com. I mostly write in the news section. So if you go on the page and you see the top news section, most of those articles up there are by me. Really, it's just like I write short news summaries, kind of from our anti-war, non-interventionist perspective. A lot of what I do is kind of put things in the proper context, especially when we're talking about Iran, because you'll see that they blame Iran for, a tanker attack, in the Gulf. But then there's actually all this context about how Israel has been attacking Iranian ships in the Gulf for years that's never included in the mainstream media. And that context is crucial to understand a story. Or a lot of the time, I'm just kind of removing kind of the fluff, the nonsense that they put in. So you go check that out. And then I started like a daily 5-day-a-week podcast. It's also on YouTube called Anti-War News, where because I write all these articles and then at the end of the day, I just summarize them. It's easier for me to do. It's all fresh in my mind. So that's a good way to keep up, because I know a lot of people don't read articles these days. They want to listen to podcasts. So you could check that out. And that's what I'm focused on now.
All that's going to be in the description, by the way, at the bottom, so everybody can link onto it as well. Dave, thank you very much for coming on and explaining the conflict to us in generalities that we can understand it. Thank you very much for coming on. And Richard, thank you very much for having us coming on as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.